Bien, muchas gracias a quienes están aquí con nosotras en esta cuarta sesión de las Jornadas de Hespérides, y muchísimas gracias muy en particular a Andrea Lozano y a Patricia Zalamea, que van a hacer la exposición de hoy día. Las voy a presentar, aunque sé que varias se conocen, tienen bastantes antecedentes ya, pero de todas maneras vamos, amerita hacer la presentación de nuestras dos expositoras. Andrea Lozano es profesora asociada y decana del Departamento de Humanidades y Literatura de la Universidad de los Andes de Colombia. Ella se dedica a la tradición antigua grecorromana y a su pervivencia y recepción en periodos posteriores, muy en particular en América colonial, como vamos a ver ahora. Es autora de una serie de artículos y también de libros. Un libro en conjunto con Patricia, que voy a presentar para las dos aquí, el libro Reinventing Obedient Themes in Viceregal Perú, The Remaking of Fertility Myths in a Quechuan Clay, editado por Brill, ni más ni menos, en 2020, y también es editora del libro Conversaciones sobre la Antigüedad Grecolatina, publicado por las Ediciones Uniandes en 2019. Es miembro fundador del Grupo Peiras, de Estudios en Filosofía Antigua y Medieval, y miembro del Grupo de Traducción de Latín de la Universidad de los Andes, entre muchas otras actividades. Patricia es, a su vez, profesora asociada del Departamento de Historia del Arte de la Universidad de los Andes de Colombia, y es especialista en arte del Renacimiento, con foco en la cultura visual cortesana y su uso de la mitología antigua, y con foco también en el uso de la tradición clásica en América Latina, entre otros temas, ¿no? Esos son los que más nos tienen relación con lo que vamos a ver hoy. Ha publicado también una serie de artículos en revistas especializadas, y además del libro que ya mencioné, es editora de El Patrimonio Artístico en Cundinamarca, Casos y Reflexiones, publicado por Ediciones Uniandes en 2014. Ha participado en una serie de proyectos, y voy a nombrar uno muy interesante, que es Unfolding Art History in Latin America, financiado por una beca de la Fundación Getty, con participación de programas de historia del arte de distintos países como Ecuador, México, Argentina y Brasil. Bien, las dejo entonces nos dejo con la exposición de Andrea y Patricia, Becoming a Humanist in Early Colonial Tunja, Crossing Distances to the Classical Past. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Brenda, por la introducción, y muchas gracias por la paciencia. Pues esto debíamos hacer en el Renaissance Society con ustedes y tuvimos que posponer debido a las dificultades de viajes, visas, etc. Así que encantadas, pues, de poder estar aquí hoy y compartir con ustedes este proyecto en el que estamos trabajando desde hace un tiempo. Voy a pasar a inglés, ¿no? Porque habíamos dicho que en inglés y trajimos preparado la presentación en inglés. Supongo que hay varias personas en el público que no necesariamente van a estar hablando español y pues queda grabado, ¿correcto? So again, lovely to be here with you, all of you today. This is a part of a project that we're working on with Andrea. The chapter that Brenda mentioned, which is actually a chapter we hope will be a chapter of the book at some point, that has to do with this question of humanism in the colonial period throughout some regions, particularly the Andean region in Latin America. And this is also what we hope to turn into a chapter, and it's the question of what it means to become a humanist in early colonial Tunja. And we're thinking of becoming because we are looking here at the very early development of Tunja as a Spanish city in the second half of the 16th century, where the city itself is becoming as well. So first, I'm going to introduce Tunja in some ways, especially relying on visual and material evidence that might point to something that we could call or construct as a humanist perspective. And then Andrea will be presenting specifically on Juan de Castellanos. So let me try to get this. Okay. So founded in 1539, the Spanish city of Tunja was a major economic, religious, and artistic center in the 16th century territory of New Granada, now basically Colombia. Modeled on Spanish types, its churches and convents were constructed in the second half of the 16th century, at the same time as private homes were being decorated with classicizing architectural motifs. By the end of the 16th century, approximately 300 houses had been built in an austere Castilian style, a number of which still retain their original portals and decorations. A first census in 1610 counted 3,500 let's say citizens, while in 1620 there were almost 5,000. I should note, along with the map that you're seeing here, which is from 1623, that recent studies show that fluidity was much bigger than previously thought. So although the city was divided into sectors, Spanish and Indian, practicality shows that they inhabited the same spaces. That is, households could have a Spanish couple and more than 10 servants of indigenous origin and African slaves. And this map, based on the orthogonal plan of Spanish cities, which of course goes back to the Roman cities, shows 130 blocks and almost 500 homes. Although recent studies have also demonstrated that this is most likely a projection. That is, that was not the size of Tunja at that time, because it doesn't even correspond to today's historical center in terms of size. So that's an interesting issue, but it has to do with this. We brought it in to begin with to give you a sense of this clarity that was in the minds of the people behind these constructions, thinking of inhabiting a future idealized city. Keep in mind also that many of these buildings were in the process of construction as Juan de Castellanos was writing, and as we will go through some of these images. The use of classicizing frames has been traced back to designs from Italian and Spanish pattern books and architectural manuals by Serlio, Vignola, and Arfi Vignafani, all of which attest to Tunja as a site for the flourishment of humanist culture based on printed sources. The printed sources, of course, for many of these architectural, sculptural, and painted motifs that we'll be showing has been identified in numerous cases. However, we think that the comprehensive study of the ways in which this imagery circulated, was absorbed, and adapted has yet to be made. And here I'm showing you facades of private homes, of the remaining columnar private home, and the facade of the Jesuit church. The facades of religious buildings evidence a similar taste for classicizing motifs, as do the homes with remaining mural paintings, such as the ones I'm showing you on the left that we will be coming back to. And you can see this in the facade of Tunja Cathedral, which was actually built under the supervision of Juan de Castellanos between 1597 and 1600. Note here, there's an inscription referring to this, but also note here how the facade in fact has changed. And this speaks to the multi-layered construction of Tunja that goes all the way to this day. So in fact, this, which is a picture from the early 20th century, is much closer and gives you a sense of this, let's call it Renaissance portal here, was much larger with respect to the building itself. And this is a little reference also to an early map showing a reference to the cathedral. I also just wanted to give you a quick sense of everything that is inside of the cathedral with this plan right here, which is a very interesting space that also has yet to be really studied. Just to give you an example of the rich remains, this altar by a private commission, let's say a private family, on one of the side naves, which has all the signatures of these types of motifs that I was just describing. And one of its main chapels, in fact, that I'm showing you right here to the left, which stands to the left of the main altar. There are also a number of such slabs, two slabs actually, that are now put into the wall of the cathedral that were originally elsewhere, but also speak to the type of culture, many times a chivalric culture, that was put in place early on. This is a chapel that I was just referring to as seen from the main altar, so it's right here. It's also a chapel that speaks to the power of certain families, of these first generation of Spaniards arriving in the area that were trying to, as we shall see, construct new spaces that in many ways were reminiscent of Spanish Spanish tradition, but in a new context. Here's a close-up of the altar piece created from Spain, but ornamented with a number of different paintings in the space, the frame that I'm showing here, details of what we might call, say, classicizing motifs. And the question is, why is this the case? And here you see the coppered ceiling, which is actually in great shape to this day, along with this classicizing frieze today. So now I'm going to turn to some of the painted cycles that survived in 3 private homes of the late 16th century. Again, you can see them in the simplified version of the 1623 map. They're all very close in range. One of them is what's known as the House of the Founder. This, which has been called the home of Juan de Castellanos, so probably, and looks like the paintings there were done after Juan de Castellanos, and this was probably not even his house. And this other home, known as the home of Juan de Vargas. These painted cycles are particularly interesting because not only do they confirm the presence of classical references, but also the citation of specific prints. They are clearly related in disposition and iconography, where we find that the imagery is really organized around a pattern derived from what are called a la antica Mannerist decorations. The religious monograms in the center, which you get a bit of a sense here and here, organize really a geometric layout, while representations of flora, fauna, heraldry, and grotesque motifs populate the sides. Most importantly, the overall ornamentation and disposition of these cycles reveals an attentive and self-conscious reelaboration of European sources in a new social and geographic context. Although the use of printed sources in early colonial art for secular and religious imagery intersected on various levels is known in many instances, the painted ceilings of Tunja constitute a singular cohesive group of what we might call secular imagery in terms of its space in the context of colonial Latin America. This ceiling belongs to the earliest cycle, dated between 1587 and 1607, the home of Juan de Vargas, who arrived from Spain in 1585 and held the post of royal scribe or escribano real in Tunja until his death in 1622. And here I'm showing you very briefly the multiple connections to the different printed sources, which I'll go through in a minute. So here's one example, this rhinoceros, which comes from this printed book itself, derived from Dürer's famous print of the rhinoceros. And then you find the elephant hunt, which also derives from one of these prints. And then most interestingly, if you look at this closely, you realize that the background behind the rhinoceros actually comes from the elephant print. So really it's a recombination of different prints. You can even find references to the Greco-Roman gods, Minerva, Jupiter, Diana, which are in fact based on Fontainebleau prints. All of this just to say these were the types of materials that were clearly available. And what we are interested in thinking about is how this constitutes, let's say, a kind of narrative structure in visual terms that speaks to the identities ultimately that these men are trying to construct. A later series of paintings that have been dated to 1616 are found in the house of the founder of Tunja, which is right here next to the cathedral. They're also placed on the main rooms of the second floor. Here I'm showing you the entrance of the second floor, the inside interior open architecture, reminiscent again of civilian architecture. And here you can see the ceiling, which was rediscovered in the mid-20th century and restored in the 1960s. Clearly, they reference the cycle in the home of Juan de Vargas in some ways in layout and motifs, similarly organized around the monograms, while on the walls that give out to the main square, which is right here on this side, you find a number of species classified, including this elephant, which is further up here to the right. So it's rather different from the elephant that we were just seeing. And there's also a little rhinoceros right here, which is one of the questions that we might also ask is what are all of these species that are non-native to the Americas doing right here? There's also another smaller room in this space with a more, let's say, narrative development with hunting scenes that envelop the walls of the smaller room. Again, many non-American animals, which include a camel, again, elephants, or many elephants, giraffes, lions, and so forth. In general, the way these spaces have been read is, I would say, mostly iconographically. In other terms, trying to do allegorical readings where, let's say, Christian and pagan symbols coexist and where the animals function as emblems. For example, the rhinoceros has been traced back to animals with special powers and noble qualities, such as a unicorn. And in the case of the Juan de Vargas home, it's actually opposite the image of Diana, the goddess of the hunt, and has been considered as a way of symbolizing chastity and nobility, which is one level of meaning. But again, we're interested in thinking about what it means to appropriate these printed sources in a new cultural context, which might lead us to a more nuanced understanding of such spaces, but also of the people who commissioned them and looked at them. So, as I mentioned before, in the first place, it is clear from the printed sources that patrons and viewers had access to recently published books of various matters. A 1664 inventory of the library of Fernando de Castro y Vargas, the son of Juan de Vargas, and the canon at the Cathedral of Santa Fe, now Bogota, illustrates a type of library established by these figures in the early colonial period of Tunja. Of the 1,060 recorded books, the subjects of poetry and philosophy stand out, with texts by classical authors such as Aristotle, Cicero, Horatius, Martial, Ovid, Pliny, Plutarch, and Virgil, various of which have commentaries and moralizations. Names such as Dante and Politian are also to be found, as are numerous grammars and poetic treatises, but also emblem books such as hacia. Just another part of the space where you also have sort of heraldic elements right here. So the conception of the earlier cycles has often been attributed to Juan de Castellanos, the prelate of the cathedral, renowned for composing the longest poem written in Spanish, the Elegies of Illustrious Men, or Elegías de Varones Ilustres, the text that we will come back to. This attribution is based on the mention of the home of Juan de Vargas in the third part of the text, as well as on circumstantial evidence. That is, the connection between the two men, which has been documented in various legal documents or sources of the time. So Juan de Castellanos' activities in Tunja as the overseer of the construction of the cathedral, his writings, and certain documents reveal his taste as a well-informed collector and connoisseur. His will of 1606, for example, lists precious imported objects such as Chinese silk, along with numerous paintings, and a series of 6 of which are paintings on Samson. In his elegies, Castellanos comments on the buildings in Tunja and praises the sculptural achievements in the cathedral by comparing them to works by Phidias and Polyclitus. At the same time, the continued citation of classical myths and their allegorical interpretations in the elegies seemingly matches the combination of mythological and Christian imagery in the cycles. Whether Castellanos was indeed the mastermind behind the cycles or not, we think that the interesting point lies in the ways in which the hybrid nature of his literary composition appears to correspond to the visual disposition in the cycle. So we think that this parallel to 16th century colonial texts and their strategies, as contextualized within what we might call a local Renaissance humanist culture that was imported and transformed, may be a productive way of exploring such material culture and its reinterpretation of printed sources in terms of what we might call narrative structure. That is, how the representations are depicted, how they are related to one another, composed and recomposed, and not just to what is being represented, which has been the more iconographic emphasis. The allegorization of pagan myth is characteristic of such texts, but so are the extensive catalogs recounting battles and the vivid ekphrasis of the New World, both for its geography and nature. Indeed, Castellanos develops attentive descriptions of nature, comparing it to a European exemplar, and insists on descriptions of vegetation in essentially sensory terms, which might be understood as an attempt to capture the essence of these elements for readers who have not seen or tasted them. So this should remind you also of the rich variety of local fruits and plants, which include avocados, guavas, papayas, plantains, palm trees, and pomegranates that were in the grains that we just saw. But again, the background, if you will, was constituted by American nature, while the figurative elements, such as the African elephants and the Roman gods, are imported. Again, we think that the important issue here is not just which sources or that there are sources, but that both figures and surroundings are purposely dislocated and recontextualized. The preference for representing non-American animals in the cycle seems particularly odd, considering that chroniclers also wrote extensive descriptions of American animals. And some scholars have suggested that the inclusion of exotic animals, such as the rhinoceros and elephants, might be a way of identifying nostalgically with other quote-unquote exotic non-European locations such as Africa. Yet, it is clear from their writings and patronage that these Tunjan men saw themselves as Spanish and built their environment as an extension of Spain. Indeed, early sources emphasize the Spanishness of Tunja. In his 1609 description, Father Molano notes how the convent of Santo Domingo was completed in such a way that it should be like one of the Spanish or convents in Spain. As has been shown by Luis Fernando Restrepo in his study of the Elegías or elegies, Castellanos' ideal hero is a Spanish Christian knight, as embodied by figures such as Gonzalo Suárez de Rendón, who was the founder of Tunja. By opposition to the indigenous mestizo or female body, the Spanish male figure is described in chivalric terms that place special emphasis on abstract values such as honor and draw attention to elaborate descriptions of the arts. I will now hand this over to Andrea, and we will now delve further into the figure of Castellanos through his writings.
Do you hear me now? Yes? Well, born in Spain in the province of Sevilla in 1522, Juan de Castellanos arrived in the Americas in circa 1539, the year of the foundation of Tunja. He would have been roughly 19 years old. Known for his expedition in what is now Venezuela and Colombia, he joined as a religious order in circa 1554 and settled in Tunja in 1562 until his death in 1607 at the age of 85. In 1568, he was named curate and oversaw the construction of Tunja Cathedral, which was completed in 1600. Through his writings, he inscribed himself within a Spanish literary tradition comparable to a type of production that may be termed as a colonial epic, meaning narrative centered on the colonization of Spanish Americans. Other well-known examples include Alonso de Ercilla y Zúñiga, La Araucana, as well as Pedro de Oña, Arauco Domada. Its first part, published in Spain in 1589, the Elegías de Varones Ilustres de Indias, may be said to belong to the genre of colonial epics, and somewhat problematic category, which may be defined for its hybrid style and combination of historical chronicles and romance poetry, replete with quotation from classical and medieval authors. The elegies specifically recounts the conquest of the territory of New Kingdom of Granada, Nueva Granada, and a number of Caribbean islands. While it may be seen as a partial record of Castellanos' youthful excursion as a soldier and a pearl diver, it is filled with imaginative relates and rhetorical strategies that include figures like hyperbole, allegory, and lengthy éxfrasis. According to Castellanos, cantar en versos castellanos la variedad y muchedumbre de cosas acontecidas en las islas y costas del Mar del Norte de estas Indias occidentales, donde yo he gastado lo más y mejor discurso de mi vida, presumiendo levantar sus edificios desde los primeros fundamentos en todos aquellos puertos que conocemos poblados de españoles. His prologue also emphasized the intention of preserving from oblivion the Spanish faith in the Indies and highlights the foundation nature of these actions. He seeks to defend his position in the Indies against peninsular authorities and laws. Because of this, Restrepo has interpreted the word as a plea for Provenza. Despite this, his loyalty to His Majesty is the main rock of this allegation. Pero resolviendo los ojos del entendimiento a una y otra parte para buscarle lugar donde la adversa no se atreviese ni pudiese lastimalla, memoria y voluntad me pusieron delante la fortísima columna y atlante de la religión cristiana, que es vuestra majestad, debajo de cuya sombra y a cuyos reales pies mis trabajos se humillan para poderse valer entre los impetuosos vientos de detractores, pues el mayor y mejor salvoconducto que se les puede encaminar es la autoridad de tan potentísimo monarca. Both purposes coexist with a mix of literary genres, history, memory, testimony, and autobiography. All of this can be clearly seen in the opening lines of the first elegy. A cantos elegíacos levanto con débiles acentos voz anciana, bien con blanco cisne que con canto su muerte solemniza ya cercana. No penen mis amigos con espanto por no comenzar más de mañana, pues suelen diferir buenos intentos, mil varios y diversos corrimientos. Para dar orden a lo prometido, orbe de Indias es el que me llama a sacar del sepulcro del olvido a quien merece bien eterna fama. Diré lo que me fuere permitido por la que descompense nuestra trama, pues para correr vías tan distantes había de tomallas mucho antes. Iré con pasos algo presurosos, sin orla de poéticos cabellos, que hacen versos dulces, sonoros, y a los ejercitados en leellos, pues como canto casos dolorosos, cuales los padecieron muchos de ellos, parecióme decir la verdad pura, sin usar de ficción ni compostura. Each genre provides a set of different devices. History is based on the first-hand knowledge, the testimony of other chronicles, and in brief, the bare truth. Memory, it nest the same things, but colored by his memory in the way he, as a protagonist and aid witness, remembered them, is justified by the relevance and the virtue of the facts narrated. History and memory support and glorify themselves using his humanistic background. For example, it seems clear that Castellanos wants to distance himself from mythical false stories about Olympian gods. Por no darse bien las invenciones de cosas ordenadas por los hados, ni los dioses de faltas religiones por la vía láctea congregados en el Olimpo, dando sus razones cada uno por sus apasionados. Ni por mi parte quiero que se lea la deshonestidad de Citere, ni bien parece ser inoportuno recontando los celos de Vulcano ni los enojos de la diosa Juno, opuestos al designio del Toyato, ni palacios acuosos de Neptuno, ni las demás deidades de Océano, ni Cantare de Doris y Nereo, ni las varias figuras de Proteo, ni cantaré fingidos beneficios de Prometeo, hijo de Japeto, fantaseando vanos edificios con harta más estima que el efecto, como los que con grandes artificios van supliendo las faltas del sujeto, porque las grandes cosas que yo digo, su punto y su valor tienen consigo. Son de tan alta lista las que cuento, como veréis en lo que recopilo, que sus proezas son el ornamento y ellas mismas se encumbran el estilo. Sin más reparo ni encarecimiento de proceder sin mácula el hilo de la verdad de cosas por mí vistas, de las que recogí de coronistas. This distance is barely stated. Well, to do this, he insistently turns to these characters, although the muse of the entire enterprise is sacred Mary. So those other gods are false. Then appealing to the classical frame is constant. It brings legitimacy and offers status to these men's stories, converting them into history. Probably, as many interpreters assert, this is why the poem was the Enid as a model. For this specific case, this means that the poem signed the price of the origin and the power of the kings, mixes past and present, some legendary reference with an historical testimony, exactly in the same sense that we just observed, and specifically defends a concrete religious ideal and a sort of nationalism, as we can appreciate in these two strophes from the second song on the first elegy. Año de 490, con 1000 y año más será pasado, cuando los argonautas de esta cuenta iban a conquistar Vellón Dorado, mas no donde Medea la sangrienta al padre viejo rey dejó burlado, pues de otra riqueza tan crecida que de sí sola puede ser vencida. Callentifis, Jasón, Butes, Teseo, Anfione, Quión, Eres, Climino, Caxtori, Pollux, Testoritideo, Hércules, Telamón, Erguino, pues vencen a sus obras y deseo los que trataron ir de este camino, haciendo llanas las dificultades que pregonando han antigüedades. Las naciones más altas y excelentes callen con el valor de la española, pues van con intenciones de hallar gentes que pongan pies contrarios en la bola, espanto no le dan inconvenientes ni temen del dragón ardiente cola, deseando hacer en su corrida de más precio la fama que la vida. All this legitimation is the main ingredient of the plea. As the Spanish voice implies, a probanza is a set of things or testimonies that recognize something as a truth. In this case, they pretend to prove their rights over territories and their exploitation, even if they have not been born as a nobleman. In the medieval times, to be a soldier, it was necessary to be a nobleman. The American conquerors want to invert things. They were brave soldiers, and now they deserve the recognition of the crown for their service. In fact, the pleas for hidalguía, this is to be an hidalgo, the lowest part of the nobility, increased sevenfold in the last part of the 16th century. Since these men were noble by birth, many of them has to construct a new identity based on their action and above all on a public recognition of these feats. Restrepo points out that in defense of their rights, conquerors resorted to narrating histories and shaping a public image. Three elements are crucial in this attempt: the collective memory that frames the narration, the heroic deeds narrated, and the virtue and courage of those who made these actions. Besides the Catholic faith, classical education was the most appealing field of reference. Contrary to the popular opinion, many conquerors had a good education. Avellaneda has demonstrated that at least 77% of the first colonies were literates. Clerics, scribes, and crown servants came to America bringing with them their books and pieces of knowledge. According to Ulises Rojas, Castellano was educated by Bachelor Miguel de Heredia, a priest in Castellanos town, Alanís, Andalusia, in grammar, rhetoric, and oratory. He even suggested that Castellanos met Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo in Sevilla in 1540. In fact, this word is frequently alluded in elegies, and many classical mentions come from it. As Castellanos did, Oviedo made use of the classical materials that come from this European education to oppose the New World to that other civilized one in which they acquire this background. This source of antithesis produces a contrasting effect. On the one side, classical work is rejected for its falsehood, and in the same sense is connected with American territories, full of Gentiles. On the other side, this connection brings glory and fame to these men who conquered this land. Indeed, this legacy not only functions as a strong man of their argumentation, but it also provides a context in which Word action are seen as a courageous and virtuous, not merely both thirsty and barbaric. For all this reason, the poetic labor is justified. It's notorious that Castellanos used their experience to compose the poem and give it weight and reliability, but doesn't boast about his own qualities or action. Neither does he dedicate any part to his own story. His perspective is autobiographical, albeit his topic is not. This is, in our judgment, a humanistic approach. As the classical poets, Castellanos disappears explicitly from his own work because his work is in the poem itself. The magnificence of the men and action narrated is the main proof of his role. His mastery is demonstrated too by the ways in which he took distance from the classical epic, yet used its strategies. Exactly in the same way, he worked for his new city. In a humanistic manner, he served himself from his cultural background and education, but he doesn't merely repeat. His way of working is critical and determined by his own purposes. In the context of the painted cycles of the houses in Tunja, the transference of motifs from the printed sources to a pictorial decoration requires a different approach to interpreting the images, not so much as an emblems, rational entities, but as a painted surface that demand a descriptive response, not unlike Castellanos' own attempts at describing nature. Rich variety is the underlying impulse of such chronicles, and overall, the imagery of the cycles recalls the hybridity of texts, filled with travels across uncharted territories and encounter with unknown species. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Andrea y Patricia, por esta exposición tan interesante y tan bonita también. Preciosas todas las imágenes y súper interesante todo lo que nos presentaron. Vamos a abrir ahora para comentarios o preguntas, si alguien entre los asistentes las tiene.
If I may, I was really struck by the emphasis on the kind of globality of or the aspiring to a kind of global presentation within the houses. And if we think about this in the context of map making and globe making in the period, could you talk more about sort of the visual appeal of presenting the world in a house, in a room, and sort of working through some of the imperial connotations of being able to sort of draw on all of these different images in one space?
Answer that. I talked about that in the previous publications, and I think it's a way of creating a microcosmos in some ways with multiple references and again, the reason we're interested in looking at this in context, in a cultural context, I think it has nothing to do with exoticizing themselves, but rather appropriating the world and creating some microcosmos. And I've also suggested that it's actually a type of Wunderkammer, those that reflects the collecting practices of the time that you could also see in prints of the time, where there were natural specimens together with artworks. And here we have all of it together, but painted. So you have, obviously it's a worldview that is dominated obviously by the Christian monograms in the center that organize around themselves. On the one hand, classical references, and on the other hand, animals, the elephants and the rhinoceros, which like Erica says, even has to do obviously with imperial connotations, and it has to do with seeing themselves as rather a continuity and an extension of Spain. And remember, the rhinoceros that I invoked had been transported from Goa to Portugal and then to Italy in 1515, which is when Durer, got to know of it, not directly, and then created this very important print that became the source of knowledge for the specimen, something that hadn't been seen in Europe since the Roman imperial times. So again, I think it's a very sophisticated appropriation of and selection of printed images that are relocated to have a new meaning and recenters or creates, you could say, a new center from which the entire world can be referenced and appropriated.
One of the things I so appreciate about that approach as I'm working on Latin epics from the Americas, there's kind of an assumption that if it was written in the Americas, it has to be about the Americas. And the answer is no, it doesn't, right? So this consumption and the question of where is core and periphery changes depending on the sorts of messages that are being sent. And what I so appreciated about your presentation was drawing out this way of sort of consuming the world, if you will, from an area that we don't think of as core, but is positioning itself in a different way than perhaps we perceive it today. So thank you very much, both of you.
May I ask a question that I think might build in some way on this discussion from Erica's line of inquiry? I was interested in thinking of was the elephant image in that same space, that the original engraving had the troglodytes attacking an elephant. So this group of kind of these the cave dwelling people, these kind of far-reaching people that are often on the edge of maps that have this kind of classical legacy and become part of cartography itself. But then when transferred into this new context, those people had been removed and we were left with the natural world in this new image. And again, I really loved this kind of description of the microcosmos and kind of describing this space of all of these images together. I thought that was like very exciting. But I just wondered when I saw that, what the kind of taking out of the people and leaving of the natural world. Because in seeing those images, I thought of many cartographic images where you have the centered map, but then, these kind of inset pieces around the map kind of demonstrating people and animals and things on the edge of the world. And so, yeah, I noted the animals and the plant life and the natural things, but the kind of the wondrous people, the kind of interesting people that went along with the image originally weren't there. And Loa, they are there. I'm sorry.
But partially, you're partially right. No, let's take a look at this because you're partially right. So you see, this one is standing right here. It's just that these have been eliminated.
Yes.
This is a section. So this one's also here, and he's actually really, really big.
Yeah.
But that's a very interesting question because again, what we're thinking about is identities, and we didn't really go into this, but I mentioned it at the beginning, and it's who is looking at these spaces. And that's why I mentioned who lives, who inhabits these spaces. It's not so clear that you have a strict, there is an urban division, but in fact, censuses have shown that there was a whole household of 20 people with very different backgrounds. So that would be an interesting question to think about, because in fact, you see this figure is made much, much bigger, much more prominent. So it would be something interesting to think about. And then these are cut out, but then this becomes part, like we were saying before, of the background of the rhinoceros, which is also fascinating because rather than go out and paint what is visible, it has to be taken out of the print as well. So I think there are a lot of things that are going on anyhow that would be interesting to think about cartography in that sense. And I haven't really put it in there that way. So they're there, but partially and transformed.
¿Alguna otra pregunta o comentario? Andrea, si no hay, pues, a mí me dio curiosidad, no sé si, o sea, preguntarle sobre ¿cuánto saben de la recepción de la obra de Castellanos en la época? ¿Tuvo mayor recepción en la colonia o en España o en los dos lugares? ¿Y si hubo reacciones?
Esa es una pregunta difícil de contestar por lo siguiente. La primera publicación de la obra que se produce en España tiene en principio, según algunos de estos intérpretes, el objetivo de ser, pues de tener un carácter probatorio en un juicio de probanza de hidalguía. Luego, esa primera publicación, digamos que está hecha para ese propósito forense y no realmente para la circulación. Sin embargo, la obra en el siglo XIX, por ejemplo, tanto en Colombia como en España, tuvo una grandísima recepción como una obra literaria de primer nivel. Ese es el caso de las críticas de Menéndez Pelayo, por ejemplo, que si bien resalta un montón el uso del latín y del español, pues porque es el poema más extenso de la lengua castellana, hay que tener en cuenta eso. Al tiempo critica muchísimo, por ejemplo, el uso de la recepción clásica que a él se le antoja repetitivo, ¿no? Entonces hay una recepción, digamos, variopinta en ese primer sentido. Vergara, que es nuestro crítico fundacional de la literatura colombiana, en cambio lo considera un texto inaugural precisamente de esa literatura, y para nosotros dentro de la constitución de nuestro imaginario pues es muy importante. De hecho, algunas personas, creo yo que con poca razón, pero se ha hecho mucho, lo consideran precisamente precursor de esa mezcla de ficción y realidad que es tan característica de algunas cosas de la literatura latinoamericana, ¿no? Entonces es un texto muy importante en ciertos sentidos. Sin embargo, es un texto poco estudiado, la realidad. Hay algunas de esas elegías que son muy recurridas por la crítica. La primera en la que yo trabajé, la elegía 14, algunas de la última parte, pero en general es un texto que merece exploración porque no está suficientemente estudiado. Hay estudios sobre el uso del latín allí, pero no sobre el uso específico de la tradición clásica, con excepción de un par de artículos de nuestros propios colegas colombianos. Ahí falta bastante trabajo.
Muy interesante. Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, si no hay, vamos a terminar agradeciéndoles, por supuesto. Yo por lo menos aprendí muchísimo. Me encantó. Quiero ir a Tunja. Precioso y tanta cosa tan interesante que ustedes plantearon, que en realidad, como dice Andrea, se abre, ¿no? Daría para muchas investigaciones en los dos ámbitos y lo que ustedes hacen, que es precioso, ¿no? El trabajo comparado. Así que muchísimas gracias. Esperamos verles entonces en una próxima oportunidad.
Los esperamos en Tunja.
Por favor.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, un gusto.
Una buena tarde para
placer.
todos y todas.
Chao.